Good morning again. I'm Doug Mauss. As I said before, I'm the new Care and Groups Ministry Pastor here at St. John. And we're kicking off our new series, Hollow. We're going to be talking each week about a different chapter of the book of Galatians, and each week about something that we look and seek fulfillment in that's ultimately hollow and leaves us not having the true thing that would give us fulfillment. And so this week, as I'm reflecting on this, one of the things that became clear to me as I was just going through my own life at the moment is just how busy, almost to the point of overwhelming, life is. I don't know about how your summers have been. Summer's supposed to be a time of slowing down the pace, relaxing a little bit, taking some vacation. But for me, it just feels like it's been nonstop, trying to keep our heads above water, trying to just keep all the things that the daily pressures of life are throwing at us. And pretty much from the moment my alarm clock goes off in the morning, throughout the entire day, I'm just working on the urgencies of the moment, the present, trying to carve out a little bit of time to plan ahead for the future, but mostly just trying to keep all the balls in the air that are juggling. I don't have time for much else. I don't really have time to reflect or to think about things because I'm just trying to keep up with the present, cast a little bit of vision toward the future. Except there is one time in the day where I do think about something besides the present and the future, and that's every night at about the same time when this happens. Every single night, right? It feels like it's your body and your brain's way of saying, oh, you might try to ignore this and move it on for the sake of keeping up with life, but no, I'm going to make sure right now in this moment where you've let your guard down because you're trying to get to sleep, now's when I'm going to nail you with all those things that haunt you and make you just relive every one of those terrible moments over and over and over again instead of sleeping. And as I was thinking about why that is, why it is for me, potentially why it is for you, what is it that's making us stay up at night pondering these things, reliving that decision we made, that choice, that couch we bought 9 months ago that's already falling apart? We apparently bought the wrong couch. Or I know there are some people that still to this day are thinking about that time 15 years ago when they got kicked out of a Renaissance festival for being too into it. I'm not going to say who that is. I just know that there is someone that has that thought at night. But as I've thought about why it is that these thoughts crop up, why they still have so much power over us in these moments when we let our guard down, I was thinking there are some things that we do that probably contribute to why these things continue to plague us. And so I want to talk this morning and start with examining some of the ways that we deal with our past struggles, our weaknesses, our mistakes. What are those things that haunt us, and how do we try to cope? And the first way is we try to pretend that they just didn't happen. All right, we look at those mistakes we made, those things that we're still embarrassed about, and we try to just cut them off from our own personal history, try to amputate them from our autobiography. I know for me, I saw that play out when I went to college. I went to college out of state, and I picked the college because it had programs in my major. It had a soccer team that I could play on. The faculty seemed really caring and invested in their students. But probably the number one reason I was excited to go to college out of state was because there was no one at that college who knew what I was like as a seventh grader. No one who had that image of me in their head. To them, I sprung fully formed like Athena out of the head of Zeus, an 18-year-old who had his act together and had no embarrassing junior high struggles at all. I think we do that too. I see people that move away from family, dysfunctional relationships, toxic things in their past, and it's simpler to move away and start over fresh. Someplace new where you can pretend that that part of your history didn't exist. That's simpler. That's one way that we deal with it. We just try to ignore it, pretend that it didn't happen. Another way I think we deal with these struggles is we try to whitewash them. We take these moments in our history, these mistakes, these sins, and we sugarcoat them. And we say, well, yeah, I admit that happened, but we kind of put this nice new edge on it and make it look a little different. And where I see that play out is in the interview process. for a job. Now, if any of you have had the opportunity to apply for employment in the last 20 years, you have probably noticed that there is one question that I guarantee you they are going to ask at some point in your interview. Doesn't matter what career field or what technical specs are required or abilities, you will get asked at some point the question, what is your greatest weakness? Or they might phrase it a little differently. They might say, list 3 great weaknesses, or what's a mistake that you've made in your past that you've learned from? And that question is a landmine. My favorite answer to that question, by the way, is this one from Dilbert. When asked about his weaknesses, his answer is, sometimes I work so fast that I become invisible. In fact, if I'm blurry right now, it's because I'm multitasking right now, right? I mean, we give these answers that are designed to not answer the question. I've seen some of the answers that people give, and it's things like, sometimes I just love the company too much, that I spend my nights and weekends just working instead of being with my family, and that's a weakness I'm really gonna work on, right? I mean, we come up with these fake answers to the question rather than engage with it honestly. Or even if we do actually admit to a real weakness, again, we find a way to sugarcoat or to make it sound not quite so bad. In fact, one of the interesting quirks about the career field that I'm in that you may not know, I don't know any other career that does this, but when you are in church work, it is expected that when you interview at a church, that your wife interviews with you. Think about that. That they're asking you all these really hard questions, and the person who knows you best in the world is sitting right next to you, seeing how you answer this question, giving you the side eye when you say, oh, my weakness is I don't spend enough time with my family on the weekends. And she's like, oh, I know you don't. I mean, she's confirming it right there. Even when I was interviewing here at St. John, we had this last spring, we had a moment too where my wife was in the interview with me, and they'd asked me to kind of talk about my life and how I'd gotten here, and so I shared that. And then we got in the car after the interview, and my wife looked at me and immediately said, well, that story was different than how I remember it. I was there for that part. That wasn't quite so rosy as the way you described it. And I said, well, I was just trying to be positive, trying to be upbeat, talk about how, it's gotten better and even the bad things. And she said, well, there's that, or there's what you did, which is you whitewash it. And her point was a good one. She called me out, was that it's one thing to actually learn from something or to find a way to understand how something has gotten better since then, but to pretend like it wasn't hard, or to act like it was this thing that you just kind of skated through and it wasn't as big of a deal for you, that's whitewashing. That's taking what was truly a hard time and not honestly wrestling with how hard it was for you and your family. We do that. Another way that I think we try to cope with our past struggles is the saddest one of all. It's when we let them silence us. When something in our past happened that is so shameful, is so debilitating or disqualifying that we think we can no longer even speak to that subject anymore. I see that play out heartbreakingly with families where parents whose job is to impart wisdom and to help steer and guide their children are afraid to actually talk with their children about some of the most important and problematic things in life. They won't get into topics of sex or drugs because the parent knows that they've got a thing in their past where they didn't handle that issue very well. And they don't want to be labeled a hypocrite. They don't want to have to say that dreaded sentence that every parent hates to say to their kid where they say, do what I say, not what I do. And so the thing that we most are required to speak into, we don't. We avoid it and stay away from it. I see it play out in public figures' lives, politicians, celebrities, these people whose lives are on public record. And so any scandal they were ever a part of, any gaffe they ever said, or any embarrassing moment that happened to them is public knowledge for the world to see. And no matter where they go or what they do, that's always going to be hanging on their heads. And so they just don't go there. They don't engage, especially when it comes to public officials whose job is to serve the citizens of their county or their state or their country. And they won't actually dive into the hard topics because they know they've got an inconsistency in their past. They know that they'd be labeled a hypocrite. And so they just don't go there. We let our past silence us. And I think it's because we handle our past struggles, our weaknesses, and mistakes in this way. That's why in this moment of unguardedness and weakness, this moment when we're trying to just lie down and get some sleep because tomorrow's going to be just as busy, is why I think our brain brings it back up. Because, see, this isn't actually dealing with our problems. And when we try to pretend like we didn't have past mistakes or struggles, sins or shame, what ends up happening is we become human beings without a history. And instead of making us this kind of perfect person with no struggles in our past, what it does is it makes us hollow. Because we're presenting someone who's been divorced from the very real struggles in our journey. We no longer have a guide to point to of things that we persevered and overcame and dealt with, because we try to act like we have none of that in our past, and what's left is a hollow version of a human being. But I don't think we have to do it that way. I think there's a way to get to the end of the night and sleep and have your brain not pester you in that moment and actually let you get the sleep you need. And I think we see the beginning of the answer to that in the book of Galatians that we're going to talk about this morning. Now, as I said earlier, Galatians is actually a letter written to the church in Galatians. And so Paul, who is one of the early Christian church planters, had planted this church, had gone away, and now was hearing some disturbing reports from the church, and so he wrote them this letter and had some instructions, some concerns, some guidelines for them. And we're going to be spending the next few weeks unpacking all of the lessons to be learned from this letter, all the hollow things that this letter exposes. But today we're going to start with chapter 1. And so chapter 1, if you've got your Bibles or you got your phone app, pull it out. If you're here with us, it's page 1167 in your Pew Bible. And so let's look at what Paul has to say to this church of believers that had come to a crossroads. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Now, this is important because this is the thesis, the purpose of why Paul is writing and what his life is about. Paul has a commission from God. He has something he needs to share, specifically the good news that comes from Jesus Christ. And because he has this purpose and mission, he has to be able to say hard things. He has to be able to speak honestly and truthfully to this church. All right, but that's what's guiding everything that we're going to read here starting now. It's not just some general lecture about life. It's that there are specific things Paul has to say and that he's been burdened by God. He's been given a purpose that he has to fulfill. That's why he's writing the letter that he's writing that we're reading this morning. And so he continues, "For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it." So notice here in this moment what Paul is talking about in his past. Now, you might not know the story. If you were here about 3 weeks ago, Pastor Dion actually shared this story as part of his message. I encourage you to go to our archives on our website, check out that message, and hear precisely what Paul is talking about. But in a nutshell, he was someone who was persecuting and murdering believers. All right, and notice in this sentence what Paul is not doing. He's not pretending it didn't happen, partly because he couldn't. They'd already heard about it. He couldn't act like that was some different guy with just a similar name. He couldn't say that. They had already heard. They knew who he had been, what he had been. They knew about his previous way of life. He also doesn't whitewash it. He doesn't say, oh yeah, I had kind of a rough patch, kind of a troublesome season. You might have heard about it. He doesn't diminish. He doesn't try to brush it away or sweep it under the rug. He calls it out, how intensely I persecuted the church of God. I tried to destroy it. But most importantly, what he does is he doesn't let him silence him. It doesn't let it silence him from the message he is driven and called by God to share with this church today. He doesn't say, oh, I used to be this guy, and now I guess I just kind of can't speak to this issue. I'm sorry you guys are struggling. But no, instead, he still says, I have to face this. I have things I need to share. He doesn't let it silence him. So we continue on. In fact, I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, my immediate response was not to consult any human being. I did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was, but I went into Arabia. Later, I returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas. And if you don't know this name, Cephas is another variant of the name for Simon Peter, who is one of Jesus' closest friends, one of his leading apostles, also known as Cephas in Hebrew. And so he went to get acquainted with Cephas, Simon Peter, and he stayed with him 15 days. And I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you before God that what I'm writing you is no lie. Now, just to kind of explain and unpack that a little bit, you might have noticed that there's a bit of a defensive tone in what Paul is writing there. And the reason for that is because Paul was being accused by a bunch of people of a few things, and we'll talk more about them throughout the next few weeks. But one of the things he was accused of was that he got his legitimacy, his credibility from these other apostles. You see, Paul didn't know Jesus personally while he was alive. Paul didn't walk in his footsteps and follow him for 3 years during Jesus' public ministry. Paul came to know Jesus later in this experience that we learned about 3 weeks ago. And so people are accusing him of making something up. He doesn't have the credibility that the apostles had. See, the apostles, they were kind of the heroes of the movement. They were the people who knew Jesus. Their lives were great and holy and heroic, and they were going through the streets and doing miracles at the drop of a hat and just kind of casually spewing God's wisdom and truth everywhere they went. And so people were saying to Paul, we've got a real message from these other people, and frankly, they're more credible and respectable than you are. And so Paul here is defending this and saying, I didn't get any credibility from them. I didn't get my message from them. I got my message from God directly. And it's because of that purpose I have that I'm not going to let my past struggles silence or disqualify me from talking about this important thing. And in fact, here's the end result of what Paul is sharing in this letter. Here's what ended up happening. That after all this, he went to Syria and Cilicia. I was personally unknown to the churches of Judea that are in Christ, except that they had only heard this report. The man who formerly persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they praised God because of me. Galatians 1. Paul's very past that was so shameful and ignominious in fact became the thing that people praised God for. Someone who has far worse things in his past than you or I are likely to have, in fact, was able to say, no, they praised God in spite of my past struggles. And so the question is, how? How did Paul move from the person we learned about 3 weeks ago, someone who has suddenly been confronted with all the wrong choices he'd been making in his life, all the things he'd been doing for zeal and all the ways he'd been trying to live up to the faith of his fathers, and in that moment to suddenly find out that not only was he not holy, not only was he not righteous, in fact, he was so misguided he was murdering people in the name of a false belief. And somehow he got from that moment to this letter that we read about today. So how did he do it? And as I've wrestled with this passage, the only conclusion I can come to is that there is in fact one very specific reason that Paul was able to take this shameful past and become a church planner for whom people praised God because of him. And it's one word: But before I tell you what the word is, I've just got to unpack it for a second because I know that this word is going to sound churchy. I know you're going to hear this word and you're going to think that is something from like last century. That is archaic. That's something that people used to do, but it's weird now and it's not part of our normal vocabulary here in the 21st century. And so I know that, but I still need you to hear this word because this is the powerful truth that helps us follow Paul's footsteps and get from shameful past that hinders and overwhelms us to people praising God. And the word is this: confession. Confession. Now, I'm sure when you hear that, because I know it's what I think when I hear that when you hear confession, your mind goes to wooden boxes in cathedrals with a screen and a bunch of Hail Marys, or maybe depending on what church background you're from, it goes back to week in and week out of church, where every week you had to say, "I, a poor, miserable sinner," blah blah, and just work through this thing and say all these negative things about yourself every week, and it triggers all these things. But I need you to understand that confession is far more than a religious ritual. It's far more than some archaic tradition that's been passed down. What confession is truly is a divine gift from God, given to us through Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago, and it still has as much supernatural power today as it's ever had. We need it as much as we always have. But so what is it? What is confession if it's not just simply a ritual or some rote thing that we say week in and week out? Here's what confession is at its most basic. Confession is taking those things in our past, taking our mistakes, our shames, our sins, our struggles, and instead of hanging on to them, instead of trying to sweep them under the rug, instead of trying to repress them and push them down and hope that nobody notices that they were there, we take them and we release them to God. We take this thing and we say, "I can't carry this anymore. It's ruining my life. It's damaging my future. It's destroying my relationships. God, can you just take this thing from me?" See, what Paul didn't necessarily share in this letter, he summarized it, but he shares it in some of the other letters he wrote, is that between the time when he was called by God on the road to Damascus and the time when he actually started planting churches and sharing the good news of Jesus was 12 years. 3 years in Arabia, as he mentioned, and then 9 years in his hometown struggling. And what was he saying, thinking, and doing in those 12 years? Here's what he was saying. He was approaching the throne of God in fear and trembling. And he was saying to God, "I am the worst of all sinners. I'm a murderer, a false zealot. I'm someone who was so misguided that I took people's lives in the name of a cause. How can you possibly have called me to be the voice to the Gentiles?" And over the course of those 12 years, Paul realized a truth that he heard from God speaking back to him, and it was this, that in that moment where Paul released that to God, in that moment where he said, "I am the worst of sinners," God looks back at him and says, "My son loved you enough to die for you. And whatever is in your past is nothing compared to the love I have for you." You see, when Jesus died on the cross, it wasn't just some supernatural proof of power. It wasn't God saying, "Oh, you want to see something amazing? I can conquer death." He actually did something specific when he allowed himself to be tortured to death on a cross and 3 days later rose again from the grave. See, what Jesus did was he took with him on that cross all the sins and shames and brokenness of humanity. He took every one of them and nailed them to the cross along with his hands and feet. And he served as a sacrifice for those sins so that they no longer had to plague and haunt us because they were now on his shoulders, not on our shoulders. And he didn't just do it one time for all those things that had happened up till that time. Right now, today, 2017, the cross is still available for each and every person who is willing to love and trust God enough to give their past to him. You see, Paul realized another truth, and I intentionally skipped it, but it was actually the beginning of what he wrote in the letter. And so now I want to share it with you after we've unpacked some of it a little more. Here's what he said to start the section that we read before. This was verse 10. We started in 11. Paul said this, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ." You see, in those 12 years of struggling, Paul was actually able to turn himself away from the opinions of other people who would judge his past and look at it negatively. He was able to look away even from his own self that would say, I'm disqualified, I can't do this anymore. And instead, through confession and receiving the forgiveness of God, he found out what it takes to have God's approval of him. And it's this: God loves you, God died for you. And because of that sacrifice, he approves of you right now. He doesn't look at your past and say, oh, that's so shameful. I couldn't possibly be a loving God of someone who acted that way. No, he looks at your past and says, I died for that too. I fixed that too. And in moments of confession, when we release our sins to God, what God says to us is not just that he's wiped that mistake off of our record. It's not just that we're forgiven, but it's that God is saying in that moment, because of the love of my son, I now approve of you. And if God approves of me, then what right do I have to continue to beat myself up over things in my past? If God approves of me, what effect can people have by judging me for things that God hasn't seen fit to judge me for any longer? See, and when we do this, when we're willing to be vulnerable and honest, when we're actually willing to take this thing of shame that haunts us and plagues us and give it to God, in that moment, we can actually stand approved before him, before ourselves, and before others. And when we do that, the amazing thing that happens is this thing in our past that haunted us, that overwhelmed us and burdened us, doesn't go away. It doesn't disappear. See, again, that would make us a hollow person. The thing doesn't vanish into thin air because we confessed it. But what happens is God does something amazing with it. He uses it to become a redeemed part of your identity. He uses it to become a part of you that's not a shame or something that holds you back, but something that in fact becomes the way that you will serve God and others in your life. That very struggle and shame will become the tool that you can use to make a difference and an impact on the people you love and the world around you. 3 ways that happens. The first thing is, when God has redeemed a past sin or struggle because of our confession of it, we now actually have credibility that we didn't have before. Give you an example. Most of you should probably know, because this is a commercial that ran for 10 years. But for 10 years, Verizon ran a commercial with a slightly nerdy looking guy, not too nerdy, just nerdy enough. And for 10 years, what did that guy say into the phone every time? Can you hear me now? 10 years, that guy shilled for Verizon, proving the reliability of their network. Do you know what that guy is doing today? He works for Sprint. Sprint has hired that guy who spent 10 years shilling for Verizon. He's now a Sprint employee, and he's now making commercials talking about how great Sprint is. And I want you to notice how that could have been read 2 ways. You know, Sprint could have looked at that and said, we can't ask that guy. That guy's been talking about how great Verizon is for 10 years. But instead, they recognized this truth that I think we all recognize as well, that in fact, the guy that's talked up Verizon for 10 years is the best guy to talk about how great Sprint is, because you're going to believe him, or at least that's what Sprint hopes will happen. Because when someone's actually willing to reverse course from what their history was, it makes you believe them all the more. We see that with Paul. People that say, hey, this guy used to kill us, and now he's saying this is the right way. There's credibility there that there wouldn't have been. And in the same way, you guys know one of the things that Christians are so often dinged for is that we don't get it. Is that we're holier than thou, that we have these perfect lives, and so we can't speak to other people's struggles because how dare we? We don't know. But when we have a struggle that's been redeemed through confession, we can speak to it all the more authentically and honestly. And in fact, we're going to have even more credibility with someone when we say to them, I do know what it's like. I have been there. I did spend 10 years on a wrong path. And that's all the more reason why you should believe me today when I tell you something different about my life and about my God. Secondly, when we actually let our struggles be redeemed through confession instead of trying to just push them away or sweep them under the rug, it actually changes our own hearts in empathy. I don't know if you've experienced these kinds of people in your life, but I know I have. Some of the most self-righteous, angry, judgmental church leaders that I've known or worked with are so often people that you end up finding out that they themselves were haunted by their own secret struggles and past. And what I've learned from watching this happen to church leader after church leader, the guy that decries sexual immorality so fiercely from the pulpit, only to find out later that this person has been struggling with sexual immorality their whole lives, is I recognize a fellow hollow person. I recognize someone that tried to pretend it wasn't there, that made themselves hollow, but it ultimately comes rushing back in. But conversely, someone who's given that to God, someone who's been confessed and had to be redeemed, they actually are more empathetic to others. They're not angry at other people for falling short. They're not mad at you for struggling or having weakness. They get it. And think about the time that you've been the lowest of the low, that worst season in your life, that darkest moment where you didn't know how you were going to get through till the next day, and someone knocks on your door. Who were you the happiest to see? That friend, that loved one who had been there. That person who you knew had struggled with something similar because you knew that they were going to understand where you were coming from. You knew that they weren't just going to blast you with shame. And thirdly, when we are willing to take those struggles and weaknesses, when we're willing to give them to God and let Him make them new, it's actually the thing that gives us victory over the worst parts of our lives. In fact, that becomes the defining thing of your story, of your journey. Think about all the famous and most well-known generals of history. All of these men whose names we still know and they're in our history books. Are they in there because they were good guys who never had any struggles or failings? Or are they in there because when the battle came, they fought it and they won it? We're not valuable and approved by God because we have no junk in our lives. And we're not valued and approved of by others because they think we don't have junk, because everyone knows that we do. But it's in overcoming that we can now speak of it differently. That struggle that used to have victory over us, that used to disqualify us, we now have victory over it because it's now been placed firmly and solidly in our identity as a forgiven Christian. You see, again, people think that being Christian means that you're perfect. No, being Christian means that you're forgiven and that you don't have to be hollow anymore. That this thing that would otherwise have to be ignored or forgotten or squelched instead can become a brand new, blazingly glorious part of your identity because you can point to it and you can say, that's who I was and this is who I am now. And in your victory, you will encourage and inspire others around you to victory. You know that this is true. I don't think I'm telling you necessarily anything that you haven't heard before because we see it happen, but it's still so hard to do in our own lives. We respect and appreciate others who are willing to share with me, with you, their own struggles. In fact, I had someone come up to me after the last service and just say, hey, as an AA member, what you said is exactly what got me off the wrong path so many years ago, and it's exactly how I live my life today. And in that moment, I don't look at him with scorn and shame. I look at him with respect as someone who has been in the struggle and knows. And I know that about him, but it still makes it hard for me to be willing to do that myself. And yet, if we aren't willing to take that step, if we think that it's respectable when others overcome their past struggles and are willing to share them and have them be redeemed by God, but we don't do it ourselves, then we never will be whole. And the image I'd like to use to help really drive this home, I struggled all week with thinking of the perfect, most theologically accurate image I could think of to help drive home the difference between being hollow and being filled with God's forgiveness. And so this is the theological, from my seminary textbook, image: the chocolate Easter bunny. Because you know the difference between a solid chocolate, heavy, thick, bite into it Easter bunny and the deception that is the hollow, looks big, and then you bite into it and it's nothing but air. And you know what? You pay more money for the hollow ones. Did you know that? You pay more money to be tricked. I read a New York Times article that was lamenting the hollow Easter bunny and talking about the children, because we have to think about the children. They said for so many Americans, that Easter bunny is their first delicious bite of chocolate, and yet for so many children, that's also their first taste of disappointment. When you anticipate this solid mouthful of chocolate and you get nothing but a mouthful of air. We don't want to be a hollow chocolate bunny. Just like we wouldn't want to eat one, we wouldn't want to be one. And this is the picture that I hope resonates with you, and you take this with you this week, that we have a way and a means to be solid, to not be an empty shell that's divorced itself from its own failings and history. We have a way to be filled whole. And it comes by not taking these past struggles and trying to ignore, whitewash, or let them silence us, because if we do that, we waste those struggles, the difference that they could have made in our lives. But if we're willing to take those very same things, confess them to God, confess them to others, God can use them and make you whole. And so what I'd like to do now this morning, as we move on to the next part of our service, is I'd like to give you an opportunity, because I am confident that as I have been talking here for the last 30 minutes, that there has been something rattling around in your brain. I'm confident of that because I know how the Holy Spirit works, and I know that I'm not the only sinner in this room right now. And so what I'd encourage you to do is to take that thing